Now let me introduce our speaker to you, Professor Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé was born in Haifa, Israel. Prior to coming to the UK, he was a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Haifa and chair of the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestinian and Israeli Studies in Haifa. He founded and directed the Academic Institute for Peace in Givat Haviva, Israel, and was chair of the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestinian Studies in Haifa between 2000 and 2006. He is now the Professor of History and Director of the European Centre for Palestine Studies in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter. His research focuses on the modern Middle East, and in particular, the history of Israel and Palestine. He has also written on multiculturalism, critical discourse analysis, and on power and knowledge in general. He's the author of many books, some of which are on the bookstall, including 10 Myths About Israel, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Biggest Prison on Earth, the history of the Israeli occupation, and with Noam Chomsky, Gaza in Crisis, which is the subject of this evening's presentation. Please welcome Professor Ilan.
Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Good, excellent. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I hope that we will have constructive dialogue on a very contentious and a very troubling topic. According to a United Nations report, next year, the 1,900,000 people who live in Gaza will live under conditions that the United Nations defined as unsustainable. Namely, what the United Nations expects is that people in the Gaza Strip will not be able to find enough food, get enough medical assistance, get enough, will have an ample infrastructure that would allow them not only to continue normal life, but actually to exist. That this report, which anybody who visited Gaza knows is a very authentic description of the reality on the ground, has been totally ignored by the press in this country and has not been at all engaged with by any politician, is not surprising. And in particular in this time and age, when it seems that the local media is engaged with the question of anti-Semitism in Britain, the Semites who are really under the danger of existence do not get even 1 minute on the wavelengths, on air, or in the printed media. And this has been the story of Palestine from the days of the Balfour Declaration. The suffering of the Palestinians were never acknowledged, whereas the suffering of the Jews were always brought up to justify the suffering of the Palestinians. It's a simplistic formula that I'm putting in front of you, but of course, if you go in depth into history, you can see that there is this kind of dialectical relationship between what the Palestinians are going through and what today people in this country feel is anti-Semitism, or is how we should engage with the known and terrible suffering of Jews in this country, and particularly in the continent of Europe. We can go back a few years earlier to 2014, when a group of people who usually organize donation for children in need around the world and always get an open door from the BBC for any kind of a campaign that asks people to donate money in order to help children who suffer from war, from hunger, from famine, or from natural or human disasters, when this particular group of people asked the BBC in 2014 to allow them some hours in the air to ask people to donate money for the children of Gaza, the BBC answered that this is a political action and refused to allow even 1 minute on the air for such a humanitarian essential demand. This boggles the mind. This raises very interesting question, especially in Britain, because the history of Palestine is so closely connected to the history of Britain. The suffering of the Palestinians is so closely associated with British policies from the moment modern Britain, or the modern British Empire, showed interest in Palestine. And yet, in 2019, it seems that history is irrelevant in the eyes of people. There's no sense of accountability, and there's a willingness to go along with ideas that were conceived by the Israeli government in order to stifle any debate or any discussion on the future of Palestine in this country. And we should do our utmost, at least to demand the space to explain why such a reality unfolds, where the suffering of the Palestinian is not at all engaged with. And whenever it comes up, whenever someone tries to frame a discussion about this suffering, they are immediately branded as anti-Semites. Which actually, if you think about the logic behind this kind of accusation, it is entirely insidious and not very logical. If I'm asking people to show solidarity to victims of racism, and you blame me for being a racist for doing it, something is wrong in your line of argument, not in my line of argument. And yet, this line of argument seems so logical. I mean, you watch television, you read even the broadsheet, mainstream papers in this country, and somehow this logic, pronounced by very intelligent people who usually are very sensitive of human suffering elsewhere in the world, somehow they can make these illogical connections and claim that they are valid morally, logically, or factually. So I think what I would like to do tonight is to do something that the debate on Palestine in this country usually doesn't benefit from. And this is time to explain. And this is not just the fault of the media because it's anti-Palestinians, because the media doesn't have time to explain things. It's a media of sound bites. It's long gone the days where the media was providing profound analysis. So there's a problem of the immediacy and the soundbite of the electronic media. So we need to demand spaces like this, to explain a bit better, but also to demand something else, to historicize the question of Palestine, to put it within a historical context. If you don't put it in a historical context, the Palestine issue is marginalized in this country, for instance, by horrific events, that took place in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Libya since 2012. And what happened in those countries is far worse than what happened in Palestine in the last 4 years. But what happened in these countries pale in comparison to what happened in Palestine in the last 100 years. But you can somehow not convince the people who produce knowledge about Palestine, whether they're academics or journalists or pundits, you somehow cannot convince them to put the historical context into the suffering of the Palestinians. And therefore, it's very easy for an editor to say, well, I will talk about Syria, I will not talk about Palestine because of the sheer magnitude of the human suffering in Syria. I don't care. I mean, compared to Syria, the daily suffering of the Palestinians are not very important. And it's not easy to demand this historical context, but we should insist on it. Otherwise, we will not have a genuine conversation on Palestine. And if we don't have a genuine conversation on Palestine, ladies and gentlemen, we won't have a genuine conversation on what goes on in Syria, in Iraq, and the rest of the Arab world. And if we are not going to have a genuine conversation on what goes in the Arab world, we won't have a genuine conversation on the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims in this country. These things are interconnected. Palestine is not just a marginal place somewhere far away from great Malvern. Palestine is the conscience of the world. It is the place where injustice unfolded in a way that really outrages anyone with a modicum of decency. And this kind of outrage against injustice does not necessarily occur because the injustice is greater than other injustices. No. It occurs when you feel that there is hypocrisy about this injustice, that this injustice is not acknowledged. Committing a crime is bad enough. Denying a crime is worse than the crime itself. And Palestinians are victims of an ongoing crime that is constantly denied in this country and elsewhere. And without dealing with that denial, you will not get very far in pushing towards peace and reconciliation in the Holy Land. And if you don't do it there, as I said, you have very little chance of bringing peace and stability elsewhere in the Middle East and by association into other parts of the world. I think now we know that these things are connected. Now, the best way to historicize, to put a historical context that would bring us to understand better why Gaza is suffering, why the people of Gaza, according to the United Nations, are facing this kind of a doomsday scenario. In order to do this, we have sometimes to reframe the narrative about Israel and Palestine, and we have to get used maybe to a different dictionary, a different kind of discussion. And the book that was mentioned in the context of the talk tonight, Gaza in Crisis, which I co-authored with Noam Chomsky, is a dialogue between us because I did not fully succeeded in convincing him to change the dictionary. And then we wrote another book, and I still didn't convince him, so probably there's a third book on its way. It's an important dialogue because Chomsky was an amazing intellectual, probably the intellectual of the 20th century. Even he finds it difficult to accept the necessary historical context in which the issue of Palestine should be discussed. It's so deeply embedded in anyone who is Jewish, like Chomsky and myself, in anyone who is fearful of anti-Semitism, as both of us are, that it's very difficult for us to accept a reality seen from the point of view of the victims of Zionism, and to accept that Jews can be both victims and victimizers. If it's hard for us, not surprisingly, it's harder for other people as well. But we have to do it. If we don't do it, we betray our humanity, our Judaism, and our sense of justice. So in order to contextualize, there is one term that I would like to introduce to you. Maybe some of you have heard it before, but I think that particular term is very useful in order to have, on the one hand, a very kind of measured debate on the atrocities in Palestine, and on the other hand, hopefully, a profound understanding why evil is enacted on the ground without branding every Israeli Jew as evil, or even the Israeli society as an evil society. The term I would like to use is the term of settler colonialism. It's a very important term, settler colonialism. It's very different from classical colonialism. In classical colonialism, Britain sends people to colonize India. It builds a colony in India. The people who are British in India see themselves as British, not as Indians. And when the British Empire collapses, the British colonists go back because they have somewhere to go back to. So they go back home. Home is not India. Home is London, Great Malvern, or Exeter. So that's the classical colonialism. It had its own evil side, but we won't go into it. Settler colonialism is a different historical phenomenon. Settler colonialism is a movement of Europeans since the 16th century who are persecuted in the continent. Sometimes because of religious persecution, sometimes because of economic crisis, or sometimes because of their culture or behavior. Doesn't matter. They feel unsafe in Europe. And they feel that they have to leave Europe and never come back because Europe doesn't want them. Is not only unsafe for them, but doesn't want them. And then they go over outside of Europe, wishing to recreate Europe in a different place. Because they still feel Europeans, but they cannot be part of Europe. And the places that they choose in order to redefine themselves as Europeans or new nations, and in which they want to feel safe because they're unsafe in Europe, the places that they choose are inhabited by another people, by indigenous people, by native people. And there was a great scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, who died unfortunately 2-3 years ago, who said that at the moment that there is an encounter between the victims of persecution from Europe with the indigenous people who live in the space which they want to make their own space, the moment there is this encounter, there are two logics that are being activated. One is the logic of dehumanization. The victims cannot see the native indigenous people as victims, as human beings. They dehumanize them. And because they dehumanize them, another logic is being activated. The logic of the elimination of the native. Eliminating the native in order to make a place for yourself that would be safe and in which you could redefine yourself as Europeans because Europe doesn't want you. The elimination of the native in some places was genocide, was physical elimination. That's what happened in North America. That's what happened in parts of South America. This is what happened in Australia and to a certain extent in New Zealand. But in some cases, such as in South Africa and in Palestine, the elimination of the native was not necessarily genocidal. There were other means used in order to have the place without the people. Now, the reason, one of the reasons, by no means the only one of the reasons that they have chosen to use other methods in order to achieve their goal had to do a lot with historical timing. You could genocide Native American people in the 18th century. It was not easy to genocide people in the 20th century as European, even if you were European victims. In particularly in Palestine, a different kind of method was developed, which I called in one of my books in 2007, ethnic cleansing. You try to take the land and kick out the people, in simple terms. And you are Jews who are victims of centuries of anti-Semitism. So you have to dehumanize the Palestinians. The dehumanization is, I don't have time to go into it, but the dehumanization is not merely by saying that they are not human beings. For instance, you would say they are nomads. They are not people who have really attachment to the land. although most of the Palestinians lived in the villages for more than 1,000 years when the Zionists came over to Palestine in the late 19th century. But you claim, no, these are not really people with true attachment to the land. They are not really a nation. They don't really have a collective will, and so on. So the kind of attempts to dehumanize, and then eventually when this doesn't help, because the people are not moving out, you have to use force to expel them, then the logic of the elimination of the native, in this case, in the case of Palestine, it is driving them out of the homeland. Not killing them massively, but driving them out of their homelands. And the early Zionists came to Palestine in the late 19th century. And when they decided to come to Palestine, they had noble impulses behind this arrival. One should not deny this. They felt rightly that Europe was unsafe. And rightly, and nobody could deny them the right, they wanted, like many other like other religious and ethnic groups in Europe, to redefine themselves as modern nations. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to define Judaism not as a religion, but as a nationalism, you're entitled to do this. If you want to find a safe haven out of persecution, nobody should deny you that. And in fact, when these early Zionists thought about Palestine, of course they also thought about the religious dimension. They thought that this is the place to redefine Judaism because of the Bible, because of the Old Testament. It all made sense, and there was nothing immoral about this line of thinking. The problem started when the leaders of the Zionist movement decided that in order to obtain a new connection to the land of the Bible, in order to create a safe haven for Jews from Europe, and in order to create a modern Jewish nation, you have to get rid of the native indigenous people of Palestine. And they did not, very few of them had moral qualms about this idea. Namely, their ideas of what they should do were far more important in their eyes than the interest, aspiration, and the very existence of the indigenous native people of Palestine. And when they arrived, it's even more ironic. Jews were not allowed to cultivate land in Europe. And they didn't know how to cultivate the few plots of land that they had bought under the Turkish rule. Palestine, as you may know, was under Ottoman rule until the end of the First World War, or Turkish rule. It was the Palestinians who taught them how to cultivate the land. And they came quite poor to Palestine and had nowhere to stay. So they used to spend the first nights in Palestinian homes. But under the candlelight or the oil lamp, they would write the first letter back home saying, we are spending the night in the home of the aliens who took over our homeland. Already the narrative that the Palestinians are not only not the indigenous people of Palestine, but they are the aliens they are hostile aliens who usurped, who took over the homeland from the Jewish people. Already at the very beginning of that encounter, these were the impressions, these were the perceptions in order to justify what would happen later on. And it was the British Empire that enabled the Zionist movement to build, between 1918 to 1948, to build an infrastructure, not only for a future state, but to build the infrastructure that would enable the Zionist movement in 1948 to inflict upon the Palestinian people a terrible human catastrophe that is still denied in this country. And especially the British role in that catastrophe is not fully acknowledged in this country. In 1948, within 9 months, half of Palestine's population was kicked out. Within 9 months. And don't think about a population only in absolute terms of how many there were. think about it also in relative terms. Think about a country that half of its people are being kicked out in a year like 1948 and are turned into refugees. Half of Palestine's villages, 500 villages, were wiped out. And on their ruins, immediately after the occupation, Israel planted forests or built Jewish colonies on the ruins of the Palestinian villages. 11 Palestinian towns were demolished, and this all within 9 months. What is incredible about this crime is that at the time, there were a lot of people whose job it was to report back home to Europe or the United States what was happening on the ground. Senior journalists, emissaries of the Red Cross, representatives of the United Nations, and they wrote very authentic, truthful reports of the catastrophe. But in 1948, nobody published these reports. The newspaper's editors were too frightened to publish a report that condemns Jewish people for committing crimes against non-Jews. The same is true about the Red Cross. The same is true about the United Nations. Only if you are a historian like myself, you can find these reports. They're not lost. They are in the archives. And you can reconstruct what happened. But nobody dared to condemn the Jewish state for committing what today we will define only in one way: a crime against humanity. And that crime was denied at the moment that it occurred. And one of the reasons, by no means, I don't know all the reasons. I've written, I think, about 10 books trying to explain that kind of connection, and I still don't think I did a good enough job, because it's not that easy to explain that kind of connection. But one thing is very clear in 1948, is that Europe doesn't want to deal with the Holocaust. It doesn't want to deal not only with Nazi Germany, but also with the allies of Germany. And in order to allow Europe to move on quickly to a post-Holocaust reality, there is nothing better than having a Jewish state absolving Germany and Europe for any responsibility by declaring that there is a new Germany. The first country in the world that declared that there is a new Germany after the Second World War was the State of Israel. You would have expected at least to be the second, given the fact that they claim to represent the ultimate victim, the victims of the Holocaust. Not the first, but they were the first, because that was the deal. You legitimize Germany, and then you get a carte blanche to do in Palestine whatever you want. And that's why you could commit that crime against the Palestinians and wipe out the villages and so on. Settler colonialism in Palestine and elsewhere, as long as it's incomplete, has a certain DNA that cannot allow even its best members of the society to humanize the indigenous, the native. Look at the American history, look at Australian history, look at South African history. You would see a lot of people who otherwise you would define as very moral, as very conscious of the other. When it comes to their own indigenous population, they dehumanize them. And therefore, this two dimension of a settler colonial movement, space and population, continues to inform what Israel is doing after 1948. In 1967, Israel was able to occupy parts of Palestine it was not able to occupy in 1948, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And therefore, it had another indigenous population under its control, millions of people. And what they did in 1967 is as criminal as what they did in 1948, and yet this is not acknowledged. Even that is not acknowledged. In 1967, Israel created what I call in one of my latest books, The Biggest Prison in Earth, a system of mega prisons. Because they could not implement the same plan of ethnic cleansing of 1948, they had to devise something new of how do you have the place without the people. And those of you who managed to visit the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a mega prison that is run through 600 checkpoints, that is based on the power of the military to determine at any given moment anything in your life. And when I say the army, it's true about the lowest ranked soldier who can decide whether to close your business, to prevent you to go from school, to board a bus, or to kill you, or to imprison you without trial. Now, what I describe here is a daily occurrence in the last 52 years. A daily occurrence in the last 50. It has ups and downs. The ups and downs have to do with how much the local Palestinians resist or don't resist this incarceration that is imposed on them, where their only crime is that they are Palestinians. So when they resist, as they did in 1987, as they did in 2000, as they did in the Gaza Strip in 2006, then Israel uses military weapons of mass destruction, not because they are nuclear weapons, because they are not meant to be used against a civilian population. They use tanks and aircrafts, and the same horrific scenes that you've seen today in Yemen, in Syria, you would have seen in Palestine in 2002, in Gaza in 2006, 2009, 2012, 2014, and I have a very bad feeling that we might see it again next year. This has a lot to do with the incompletion of the ethnic cleansing of 1940. Now, I don't want to sound too pessimistic because I'm optimistic. I really am. I'm an Israeli Jew. I was born in Israel. I was kicked out of Israel in 2007 because of my views. I was fired from my university. I was banished to exile in Exeter, which is not too bad, I have to admit. Some people were exiled to Siberia. Exeter has some things which remind you of Siberia, but it's not that bad. But I'm still going back as much as I can to continue with the struggle on the ground. And what is important for individuals in such a struggle is, I always say, is to be VIPs. Is to visit if you can. And not everybody can visit now Israel. There is a new monitoring system that if you ever expressed in the internet or elsewhere something which Israelis would deem too critical, you might be sent back from either Ben Gurion Airport or when you try to cross into the West Bank from Jordan. But if you can visit, because nothing I will tell you today compares to what you will see in few minutes on the ground. I'm so confident about it because I know how much Israel is now trying to prevent people from seeing what goes on there in the occupied Palestine. Israel has a special program called Discovery. Discovery is a program by which Israel brings young American Jews to Israel to show them Israel with the hope that they will be so fascinated they will immigrate to Israel. Now, what happened was that quite a few of these young Jews, when they saw what was going on in Israel and Palestine, they became activists against Israel in the campuses after this trip, so Israel stopped the program. I think what they'll do now is just bring them to the airport, a short trip to Tel Aviv, and back to the airport to make sure that they don't see any of the evil that unfolds on the ground. So visiting is very important. The I for the VIP is informed. If you are knowledgeable enough about these places, and if you are convinced, as I am convinced, that knowledge here is not just about what happened in Palestine in the last 70 years, what happens today in Palestine. If you are convinced that there is a connection between the injustice in Palestine to other cases of injustices in the world, not only political injustices, but also social injustices, and also other cases where our neoliberal society treats workers sometimes like indigenous people. I think if you are convinced that, you will understand the kind of phenomenon that I saw in my traveling in the world. I saw people in Argentina, teachers, demonstrating for better salaries, donning themselves with the Palestinian flag without even knowing where Palestine is. I saw people in Norway who went on strike putting the Palestine flag because it's a symbol for not only injustice but also social injustice. The only people who don themselves in this country with Israeli flag is the English defense, the EDL. So it also tells you something about the symbolic flags. So I think if you can inform yourself and others, it's very important. And the P for the VIP is the protest. We need you to protest, to help us, to redress an imbalance on the ground, without which the people of Palestine might be wiped out of history, not just being ethnically cleansed, but wiped out. We need the solidarity. We need your support for actions of boycott and divestment and sanction, because these are non-violent means to achieve justice in Palestine. And without an international support for a non-violence strategy, young people in Palestine, and this is the youngest society in the world, young people in Palestine would believe that only violence is the way to change the reality on the ground. So we all have, I think, a moral obligation, not just to know what's going on, but express our views and protest. And yes, in this century, in March 2019, such an act may bring on you the wrath of people who would immediately brand you as anti-Semites. So always remember three things. One is that the Palestinians are also Semites. The second thing is that most of the leading activists today asking for pressure on Israel are Jews themselves. And the third thing, which I think is the most important one, is that only you yourself know if you are a racist person or not. And if you know that you are not, nobody can intimidate you into paralysis just because they called you a racist person. So I think I'll stop here, and maybe we'll warm up a little bit this chilly church with good provocative questions. Okay, thank you very much.